Alexander loved night trip. The darkness and emptiness of the road always calmed him, helping him to escape from the daily routine. However, that night something was off. The moonlight barely pierced through the clouds, and thick fog enveloped the road, almost as if trying to hide it from prying eyes. He was heading home after meeting his friends, and ahead of him was a long stretch through desolate parts of the highway. Behind the wheel, Alexander felt confident, but with each passing minute, a sense of unease grew in his soul. Suddenly, a gas station sign appeared on the roadside, old and peeling, yet still visible in the headlights. He was low on fuel, so Alexander decided to stop and avoid the risk of running out of gas in the middle of nowhere. When he turned into the station, the first thing that caught his eye was the shabby appearance of the place. A lone light by the entrance flickered, and the store's windows were covered in dust. It seemed like the place had been abandoned for a long time, but there was a hand pump on the fuel dispenser that looked functional. A man emerged from the shadows, an elderly, hunched figure with a face marked by deep wrinkles. He wore a faded coverall, and his gaze was alert, almost suspicious. "Good evening," Alexander said, rolling down the window. "Can I get some gas?" "Of course," the man replied, studying the car intently. "Tonight, it's unsettling. Where are you headed?" "Home. About 2 hours left." The old man nodded, but his gaze lingered somewhere behind Alexander's shoulder. "This road's a tough one, especially at night," he began, shaking his head. "Sometimes you'll see headlights." "Headlights?" Alexander furrowed his brow. "Well, traffic is rare around here. Not those kind," the old man chuckled, his eyes glinting in the light of the lone lamp. "A car. A strange one. Its headlights appear out of nowhere, and then, well, you'll see for yourself if you're unlucky." Alexander was about to make a joke, but there was something odd in the man's voice. Not fear, but a mix of warning and resignation. "And what's with this car?" Alexander asked, feeling a chill run down his spine. "If it passes you, consider it the death coming for you," the old man said, his tone suddenly serious. Alexander fell silent. The man's words sounded like an urban legend, but there was something terrifying about them, especially in combination with the fog and the oppressive atmosphere of the night. "Thanks for the warning," he said briefly, paying for the fuel. The old man said nothing, only disappearing back into the station's shadows as if melting into the night. Alexander got back into his car and continued driving. Music played softly from the speakers, but the feeling of unease didn't leave him. There was no other car in sight. Just him, his car, and the endless darkness. About 40 minutes passed. The fog grew denser, and the beams from the headlights could no longer cut through the thick white cover. Alexander slowed down, not wanting to accidentally veer off the road. Suddenly, he noticed headlights in his rearview mirror. They appeared from a distance and quickly approached. "Finally, someone else," he muttered, feeling a strange sense of relief that there was another car on the road. But as the car got closer, his stomach tightened. The headlights were too bright, almost blinding. Alexander had to shield his eyes with his hand to avoid losing control of the vehicle. When the car passed him, he saw neither the make nor the license plate, just a silhouette like a shadow. "Strange," he exhaled, speeding up to catch up to it. But the car disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. A few minutes later, the headlights reappeared. This time, they were right in front of him. The car was approaching with incredible speed. Alexander swerved sharply to avoid a collision, and the car zoomed past him. His heart was racing. "What kind of damn joke is this?" he thought, wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans. At that moment, he remembered the old man's words. "Ridiculous," he muttered to himself, trying not to panic. But the headlights appeared again. They flickered in the side mirrors, as if playing cat and mouse with him. Alexander tried to speed up, but his car started to sputter. Panic overtook him. The headlights caught up, and the blinding light flooded his eyes. The car seemed to pass right through him. Suddenly, his engine died, and the car slowly came to a stop in the middle of the road. Everything around him sank into total darkness. Only the silence and the cold night air remained. Alexander got out of the car, trying to find something that could explain the malfunction. But in the light of his flashlight, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. In the distance, a faint hum sounded. The headlights reappeared, but this time they moved slowly, as if watching him. Damn! He exhaled, realizing that running away would be pointless. The car stopped a few meters from him. The driver didn't get out. The door opened on its own, inviting him in. Alexander didn't know what to do, but he remembered the gas station man's words. "If it passes you, it's the end." "No way," he shouted and ran back to his car. The engine started on the first try. He sped forward sharply, and the headlights stayed behind. But the road seemed endless, as if he were trapped in some nightmare. At dawn, Alexander finally reached the city. Sweaty and with red eyes from lack of sleep, he stopped at the first cafe he found to collect himself. The bartender, seeing his condition, asked, "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Alexander shook his head. He wanted to tell him, but he knew it would sound crazy. "Just a strange night," he replied. The bartender smiled and quietly added, "You're lucky you made it back. Not everyone comes back after meeting that car." Alexander froze. "You know about it too?" "Of course. The legend's old, but they say some people still see it to this day. If it passes you, you'll never leave the night." Sarah never liked coming home late at night, but that day she had to stay late at work. The clock read 11:50 p.m. as she, tired and irritated, arrived at the empty bus stop on the outskirts of town. The last bus on her route had already left, and Sarah considered calling a cab, but decided to wait a bit longer. Sometimes buses came even after the schedule. The night was dark, the street deserted. The only sound was the rustle of the wind in the trees. Sarah felt a slight unease but chalked it up to exhaustion. She checked her phone, too low on battery to call for a cab. Suddenly, a faint hum of an engine broke the silence. Sarah turned to see headlights approaching. A worn-out bus pulled up to the stop. Its appearance was strange. Peeling paint, a faded license plate, and on the electronic display, instead of a route number, the words "Special Service" glowed faintly. "Well, it's better than nothing," Sarah muttered, assuming the bus was heading in her direction. She stepped onto the platform, glanced quickly at the driver, and felt a chill. The man behind the wheel looked strange. Dressed in a faded uniform, eyes obscured by his cap, his face expressionless, frozen like a statue. "Are you going downtown?" she asked. The driver gave a silent nod. Sarah paid for the ride and walked deeper into the bus. The interior was even creepier than the exterior. The old seats creaked, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. There were only a few passengers, all sitting silently, staring out the windows. Sarah felt uneasy but decided to ignore it. After a few stops, she noticed the bus veering off the usual route. The streets grew narrower and darker. It took her a moment to realize that the buildings had disappeared entirely. Only sparse trees and dense forest surrounded them now. "Hey, you missed my stop," she shouted at the driver. He didn't respond. Sarah stood to approach him, but a voice from behind stopped her. "You'd better sit down." It was an elderly woman sitting in the front row. Her face was unnaturally pale, and her eyes locked onto Sarah's. "What's going on?" Sarah asked. The woman didn't reply. Then Sarah noticed the lights inside the bus dimming, as if the bulbs were running out of power. The passengers remained still, though some began to sway slightly, as if too weak to hold themselves upright. The bus turned onto a narrow road leading deeper into the forest. Minutes later, they arrived at an iron gate. Sarah's heart sank. Beyond the gate lay a field filled with hundreds of stone markers. A cemetery. "Stop the bus!" Sarah screamed. The driver finally turned his head. His face was eerily pale, and his eyes, they were empty, devoid of life. "End of the line," he said coldly. The doors opened with a groan. None of the passengers moved, except for Sarah. Panic overtook her as she looked around. The woman who had warned her now stared straight ahead, seemingly uninterested in what was happening. Sarah bolted for the exit, but as she stepped onto the ground, she realized she was completely alone. The bus creaked as it shut its doors and slowly drove back into the forest, leaving her at the edge of the cemetery. At first, she didn't know what to do. Trembling with fear, she spotted a faint light near the cemetery gate and decided to head toward it, hoping it would lead her to a road. As she got closer, she noticed something strange. On one of the graves lay an old, tattered bus uniform, the same kind the driver had worn. Beside it stood a headstone with a name etched into the surface. It was familiar. She'd seen it on the driver's name tag when she boarded the bus. For a moment, she froze. Turning to run, her eyes caught something even more horrifying. The gravestones around her began to glow faintly, illuminating the inscriptions. She started reading them one by one. Sophia Larson, died in a bus accident, Route 13, 1982. Michael Haig, passenger on special service, 1982. There were dozens. The last one made her knees buckle. Sarah Mason, missing since 2024. It was her name. Her breathing turned shallow, and her legs felt like lead. She turned around and saw the bus emerging slowly from the woods, its appearance even more decayed, shattered windows, rusted doors. Sarah ran, hearing the screech of brakes behind her. The bus seemed to chase her, as if determined to take her back. But as she stumbled onto the highway, the sound of the engine suddenly ceased. She turned to look. The bus was gone. She was found on the road early the next morning, in a state of shock. She tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed her. Only an elderly driver from another bus route quietly said, "You shouldn't have boarded the special service. They say it only ever goes to one place." From that day on, Sarah never rode a bus at night again. John was never afraid of night drives. He enjoyed the silence, empty roads, and the feeling that the whole world was asleep as he sped along. Working for a large transport company, he was used to long routes, and another night shift didn't seem out of the ordinary, especially since his cargo had to be delivered to the next town by dawn. The road was deserted, with only the occasional distant glimmer of farmhouse lights outside the window. The radio played old rock hits monotonously, and John was considering turning on an audiobook to stay awake. Around 1 in the morning, he noticed a figure on the side of the road ahead. It was a woman. She stood there, hugging herself as if she was cold, and raised her hand to flag down the car. A mix of emotions swept over John. He knew that it was rare to find someone genuinely in need of help on the highways at night. Still, he couldn't ignore the possibility that she was in trouble. As he approached, he slowed down and stopped a few meters away from her. The woman looked to be around 30, her hair was messy, and her clothing seemed old-fashioned, a long coat and a scarf. She walked up to the car and, without lifting her head, quietly asked, "Could you please take me to the city?" "Sure, hop in," John replied, watching as she carefully opened the door and settled in the back seat. Along the way, she hardly spoke, giving short answers to his attempts at conversation. When John asked what she had been doing on the highway at night, she simply said she was walking from a village and had missed the last bus. John couldn't shake off a strange feeling gnawing at him, but he chalked it up to fatigue. Yet, he noticed a faint chill emanating from the woman, despite the warm interior of the truck. As they neared the outskirts of the city, the passenger quietly said, "Here is fine." John turned onto a small street and stopped in front of an old 2-story house. Its windows were dark, and it looked abandoned. The woman thanked him, quickly got out of the car, and headed toward the house. "Hey, do you need help with the door?" John called out, but there was no reply. The woman disappeared beyond the threshold, leaving John alone in the quiet. He checked his watch. It was time to move on. But something made him linger. The house looked strange. Peeling paint, a broken window on the second floor. A thought crossed his mind. Who could even live here? John decided not to dwell on it and was about to drive away when he noticed something on the back seat. It was a photograph. He picked it up and felt a chill run down his spine. The photo showed the same house, but in much better condition. A group of people stood in front of the door, and in the foreground was his passenger. On the back of the photo, a note read, "Sanctuary, 1952. John felt a cold knot tighten inside him. He looked back at the house. Something about it now seemed even more unsettling. Suddenly, he caught a glimpse of a shadow moving past one of the windows. He stared intently but saw nothing. Within minutes, John was back on the road, feeling an unexplainable fear creeping through him. He tried to calm himself, thinking it was just exhaustion playing tricks on him. The next morning, after completing his delivery, he still couldn't shake off the strange encounter. Curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to ask about the house. At a local gas station, he mentioned the address where he had dropped off the passenger. The cashier, an older man, looked at John in surprise. "Are you sure? That house was torn down about 20 years ago. Nobody's lived there for ages. What do you mean torn down?" "I just dropped a woman off there last night," John exclaimed, panic creeping into his voice. "Wait, a woman, you say?" The cashier furrowed his brow. "There's an old story around here. They say a girl used to live in that house back in the 50s. She often hitchhiked on the highway, but one day she was found dead in the woods. Since then, drivers sometimes claim they see her on the road." John went pale. He remembered the chill, the photograph, and the eerie house. He wanted to argue, but he realized there was no point. The photograph was still in his truck, and he didn't dare touch it again. From that day on, John never picked up hitchhikers at night.